An elderly woman leaves her inherited house to a homeless stranger, but her son refuses to accept it and does something that shocks everyone. Charlotte had always believed in the dignity of small things. She didn't seek greatness, nor did she need it. For her, value was found in what was done with honesty, care, and silence. She became a widow at a young age and had no choice. She raised her only son, Frank, alone. She worked as a seamstress her entire life, stitching pieces in long and tiring shifts, supporting the house with what she earned and with what she endured in silence. There was no luxury, but there was effort, and that effort sustained the years and the days, one by one. Charlotte did not have grand achievements, but she lived marked by constant choices of renunciation and dedication. She didn't accumulate wealth, but with the little she saved, she built a simple, small house piece by piece, with what time allowed. That space represented more than shelter. It was safety, warmth, and belonging. The neighbors knew her as a reserved, discreet lady, but also as someone with a sensitive and generous heart. Frank grew up surrounded by this silent rigidity. He never went hungry, but he also didn't have excess. He saw his mother's effort up close, but he never understood it. When he became an adult, he distanced himself. He became ambitious, cold, obsessed with status, and with an image that rejected everything that reminded him of his origins. Charlotte's humility embarrassed him. He avoided visits, called less and less, and his indifference only grew. Charlotte, although hurt, never held a grudge. But with time, she stopped expecting anything from him. She understood in silence that Frank had become a stranger. Charlotte gradually began to fill the silence around her with gestures that came from the outside, those that did not require words but left marks. The loneliness no longer hurt her as it once had. It was in this state of peaceful vigil that she noticed, across the street, a man who kept repeating his presence. Always sitting on the same bench in the square, head down, discreet posture, he didn't seem to be waiting for anything. He was there without asking for anything, without drawing attention, but his constancy intrigued Charlotte. At first, she only noticed his presence when she opened the window or swept the sidewalk. Then, she began to notice the time he appeared, the way he kept his eyes low, the same clothes marked by time and the street. The repetition of that silence in front of the square sparked a desire she couldn't explain right away. Perhaps it was just curiosity, or perhaps it was the recognition of someone who, like her, knew the weight of being alone. He did nothing. He didn't extend his hand, didn't ask for coins, didn't speak to anyone. He just stayed there, almost motionless, as if part of the scenery. And yet, there was something about him that touched her. Maybe the way he remained there without demanding attention, or perhaps the way his eyes seemed to carry a story he didn't tell. Charlotte spent days just observing. Sometimes she hesitated at the door with a cup in her hand, thought about approaching him, but stepped back, until one of these days the wind was too cold and she couldn't ignore it. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, approaching cautiously. "Would you like some hot coffee?" The man looked at her with restrained surprise, as if he didn't know if it was real. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cup with both hands, without smiling, but with a gaze that softened for a moment. The next day, she showed up with a piece of bread. "Today is colder than yesterday. I thought maybe you'd want something to go with the coffee," Charlotte said. "That's very kind," he replied with a slight nod. Days passed and the gestures repeated. A coffee, a piece of bread, a fruit, an old blanket Charlotte had kept since Frank was little. The man never asked for anything, never complained, never forced closeness. He just accepted quietly, like someone who understands the value of what's being offered. "My name is Charlotte," she said one morning, extending her hand. "Jeffrey," he replied, shaking her hand firmly with a slight bow of his head. She didn't ask anything at that moment, but the name opened a door. Jeffrey. A simple name, but one that already carried the presence of someone real, not just a figure sitting in the square. After that day, they began exchanging brief greetings. A good morning, or it's colder today, a nod. Slowly, at the pace of someone with no hurry, he began to speak. He didn't tell everything at once. It was as if he were testing, little by little, whether she was really willing to listen. "I worked in construction," Jeffrey said one afternoon, moving his hands as if still holding an invisible hoe. "I was a bricklayer's assistant. It was hard, but it was honest." Charlotte simply nodded, not interrupting. She had this gift of listening without seeming like she was expecting anything in return. "I spent years doing that, working straight through from sunup to sundown. It was never easy, but it was what I had. And we managed." "You lived with your family?" Charlotte asked in a neutral tone, just to make him comfortable. "Yes. I had my wife and a little girl. We lived with the basics, but it was our house, our place." He stopped for a moment, looking at the ground as if searching for something that was no longer there. "There was an accident at the work site. I fell from a high place, broke my leg. I was out for months. No boss paid insurance. They fired me like I was dead weight." "Didn't you get help?" "Nothing?" Charlotte asked, more as if sharing the indignation than demanding answers. "Nothing. Just silence. The bills started coming. Rent overdue, food missing. My wife tried to hold it together, but with a small child..." He sighed, long and heavy. "One day, she said she was going to ask for help from some relatives of hers. She took the little girl and left. Never came back. Never sent word. Never answered." Charlotte looked at him with tear-filled eyes but didn't say anything. She let him have that space to continue. "I tried to find her, but there was nowhere to go. No work, no house, nothing. First, I went to a shelter, then to the streets." He ran his hand over his unshaved beard as if trying to wipe away the memory. "I didn't give up. Never begged. Never sank into drink. I just tried to get a little work here and there, but living like that, it's like fading away. People don't see you anymore." "I saw you," Charlotte said calmly, "from the first day, and I kept seeing." Jeffrey stared at her for a moment. His eyes were red, but there were no tears. It was just accumulated weariness, the kind that time doesn't easily erase. "That's why I accepted the coffee. It wasn't just the warmth of the drink, it was the gesture, and then the bread, and then the blanket. I'm not used to this." "Used to what?" Charlotte asked, tilting her head slightly. "Someone who looks at me without fear, who listens without trying to change anything, who just listens." Charlotte held the cloth she had in her hands and said, "You don't have to deserve to be seen. You just have to exist. The rest, life will take care of." Jeffrey lowered his eyes, absorbing those words as if hearing something he didn't know he needed to hear. There was a light silence between the two of them, the kind that doesn't make things awkward. It just hung there, suspended, like a respectful pause between two strangers who weren't so strange anymore. Another time, he came with torn pants. "Did you hurt yourself?" Charlotte asked, concerned. "I tried to climb a branch to pick a mango. Didn't go well," he replied, embarrassed. "Come in, I'll sew this up right now," Charlotte said, opening the gate without waiting for a response. The first time he entered the backyard, he walked carefully, as if stepping on sacred ground. Charlotte guided him to a plastic chair in the back and brought thread, needle, and a piece of fabric to mend the tear. "You sew even the stories of others," Jeffrey said with a grateful look. "Sewing is my way of keeping things whole," she said without vanity. Over time, he began to appear more often. He never intruded, but always offered help. "This faucet is dripping, Mrs. Charlotte. Can I try to fix it?" "If you want, feel free. Just don't make it worse," she said with a nearly amused tone. "I promise I'll try to make it better than it was," he said, grabbing the wrench she handed him. Then it was the backyard. He started sweeping, cleaning the dry leaves, pulling the weeds between the stones. "I like doing this. It reminds me of my mother's yard," he commented once. "You take good care. This house thanks you," Charlotte said. On a day with heavy rain, he showed up completely soaked. "You don't need to stay out there today. The back room is empty. It's just dust and junk. But there's an old mattress. If you want..." "Are you sure?" "Of course, Jeffrey. Here, no one needs to get sick to prove they deserve a roof." He stayed the night there, then another, and then more, never abusing the trust, never crossing boundaries. He took care of the space as if it were his own. "You don't have to do this, you know. There's no obligation," Charlotte said one time, seeing him fixing the garden fence. "It's not out of obligation. It's because it does me good, and because here is the closest to a home I've had in a long time." Charlotte was silent for a moment. She felt a lump in her chest, something she hadn't felt in many years. "Then take care of it like it's yours. Because I think it does me good to know I'm not so alone." Time passed, and without them noticing, it became routine. Jeffrey had lunch with her, slept in the back room, helped with the chores, and more than that, kept her company. "Have you thought about finding your daughter?" Charlotte asked one time while sewing. "Every day, but I don't know where to look. Her mother left angry. I stayed behind." "Do you still have anger about that?" "No, just longing." Charlotte breathed deeply. That hurt her in a different way. It was as if she saw in Jeffrey a kind of reflection of herself, someone who also lost, who was also left behind. One spring afternoon they sat in the garden, she with tea, he with a glass of water. "Jeffrey, have you thought about going back to your hometown?" "I don't know if I still have a town or a place to come from. I think I've just been staying along the way." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher something she already knew. "You're not a lost man. You're just out of place for now." "Maybe this place is here," Jeffrey said. That night, Charlotte had trouble sleeping. She thought about everything. She thought about Frank, the emptiness between them. She thought about Jeffrey, his constant presence, their mutual respect, the silent care. And she thought about the house she had built with so much effort, alone, and perhaps now there would be no one to leave it to. In the days that followed, the idea began to take shape, but she said nothing. She watched Jeffrey, silently testing what she felt. One day, seeing him arranging the pots on the porch, she felt sure. She made an appointment with Rebecca, the neighborhood lawyer. "I want to make a will," Charlotte said, sitting in the small office chair. "Are you sure, Charlotte?" Rebecca asked, removing her glasses. "More than ever." "Are you leaving the house to your son?" "No, I'm leaving it to Jeffrey," the lawyer frowned. "Jeffrey, the man who stays in your back room?" "Yes, he's the one who takes care of me. He's the one who's here." "Don't you want to think about it some more?" "I've thought about it enough." "Do you want to leave any written explanation?" "No, just register it and keep it. When the time comes, he's the one who should stay." Rebecca nodded silently. She had known Charlotte for years. She knew that when Charlotte made up her mind, it was final. She filled out the papers carefully, read them aloud. Charlotte signed with firm hands. As she left, she stopped in front of the gate, looking at the sky. "It's not about justice. It's about truth," she said, as if speaking to herself. But Rebecca heard her, and she kept that phrase because she knew that somehow it was what sustained everything Charlotte had done up until that point. In the days that followed the visit to Rebecca's office, Charlotte continued her routine as usual. Nothing in her behavior suggested she had made such a definitive decision. It was as if, by sealing that will, she had allowed herself a bit of peace. Jeffrey noticed that she spoke less, but smiled more. She spent more time sitting in the backyard, watching the sky, the wind blowing through the leaves, the sound of distant voices on the street. He respected her silence. He was always nearby, taking care of the house tasks, the plants, the little things she could no longer do on her own. But he didn't ask. He felt something was changing, and he understood it wasn't his role to interrupt. On a particularly cold morning, Charlotte took longer than usual to come out of her room. When she finally appeared in the kitchen, she was pale, her eyes sunken, her breath short. "Would you like me to make tea?" Geoffrey asked, standing up from his bench without hesitation. "That would be nice, thank you," Charlotte said, her voice weaker than usual. She sat at the table slowly, as if every movement required effort. When Geoffrey placed the cup in front of her, she held the porcelain with both hands, trying to warm her fingers. "You know life doesn't give notice when it's about to end," she said, looking at the steam rising from her tea. "I know," Geoffrey replied simply, "but sometimes you feel it. Right here," she said, putting her hand on her chest. "It doesn't hurt, it just weighs." In the following days, her health rapidly deteriorated. She refused to go to the hospital. She said she didn't want to spend her last days in a white corridor surrounded by strangers. She preferred the house, the backyard, the smell of flowers. Geoffrey stayed by her side the entire time. He prepared food, changed sheets, read to her in a low voice, a very old book of stories he found on the shelf in the living room. Charlotte listened with her eyes closed, as if diving into another time. "You don't need to do all this," she murmured one night, her voice weak. "I don't do it because I need to. I do it because I want to," Geoffrey said, holding her hand. On the morning Charlotte died, the house was silent. Geoffrey entered the room with tea on the tray, as he did every morning. He called for her. There was no answer. He approached slowly. Charlotte was lying on her side, her eyes closed, her expression serene. Geoffrey knew at that moment that she would not open her eyes again. He sat by the bed and stayed there for a while. He didn't cry. He just kept his hand on hers, firm, like a silent promise that he would stay there. Then he called Rebecca, as Charlotte had instructed in a conversation a few days before. "She's gone," Geoffrey said, his voice low, "like a breeze that disappears at the end of the day." Rebecca arrived hours later. She entered the house with a serious face, hugged Geoffrey without saying a word. She took care of the arrangements, notified the funeral service, and organized everything discreetly. She knew Charlotte didn't want a long wake or exaggerated tributes. She only asked to be buried simply as she had lived. And so it was done. 2 days later, Rebecca contacted Frank. She called the number he had left years ago. He answered with suspicion. "I'm Rebecca, your mother's lawyer. She passed away the day before yesterday." "What do you mean?" Frank said, surprised. "No one told me anything. She left instructions. She wanted me to handle everything discreetly. She asked that you be informed after the funeral." Frank fell silent for a few seconds, then asked, "And the house?" "We have a will. Your mother left everything registered. She left the house to me." Rebecca took a deep breath before responding. "No, she left the house to Geoffrey." "Huh? Who the hell is Geoffrey?" His voice rose, full of disbelief. "A man who lived with your mother in her last months. Someone who took care of her when no one else was around." "This is absurd," Frank said, now angry. "She must have been senile. This is invalid. She was lucid. I personally oversaw the entire process. The will is legalized, signed, and registered. No, this won't stand." And it didn't. Frank showed up in the city 3 days later, furious, dressed in a suit, banging on Rebecca's office door with heavy steps. He demanded to see the documents, shouted in the building's lobby, called Geoffrey an opportunist, accused his mother of being manipulated. "This is an outrage. That house is mine by right," he said, standing in front of Rebecca's desk. Legal right isn't the same as emotional right, Frank, she said firmly. Are you on his side? That bum? I'm on your mother's side, and on what she decided, with full awareness. Frank left, huffing, and he went straight to court. He tried to challenge the will by claiming mental incapacity, alleging manipulation, saying his mother was weak and vulnerable. He hired lawyers, presented reports, demanded evaluations. Meanwhile, the town reacted. The whispers started, the sideways glances, the versions of the story. Who was Jeffrey? What did he do to convince an old lady to give him the house? What kind of influence did he have? Some neighbors started avoiding the silent man who now lived in the deceased's house. Others greeted him with pity, as if greeting someone marked. But there were also those who took a stand. Jessica, Charlotte's friend of decades, didn't hesitate. He took care of her like no one else, she said loudly in the bakery. He wasn't a relative, but he was more present than the son. The grocery store owner also spoke. Charlotte always said his heart was cleaner than many of those suited-up folks around. And over time, what was prejudice was balanced out by stories, memories, and observations. The figure of the unknown man began to change. He wasn't a stranger. He was simply someone who had been where no one else had been. But Frank didn't give up. He pressured Rebecca with daily calls. Review the papers. There must be something wrong. Everything's fine, Frank. You've been bought by him? Respect me. And respect your mother, even if it's too late. When he saw he couldn't win the legal route, he tried the illegal one. He attempted to bribe a registry employee to cancel records, delay processes, and create loopholes. Nothing worked. And then, in a fit of rage, he did what no one expected. He went to the house, waited for Jeffrey to leave for the market, and broke in. He smashed windows, kicked doors, tore curtains, threw pictures to the ground, opened cabinets violently. In Charlotte's bedroom, he ripped apart the patchwork quilt she had sewn by hand. He threw the old sewing machine to the ground. He yanked her portrait off the wall. "This house is mine!" he screamed as he destroyed things. He was heard by the neighbors. They called the police. He fled before they arrived, but the damage was done. And the news spread. Jeffrey returned and found the house in ruins. He didn't say anything. He sat on the floor of the living room among the debris. He picked up Charlotte's portrait and wiped it with his sleeve, slowly, as if asking for forgiveness. He took a deep breath and stayed there for a long time, in the center of a violated memory, without saying a word. When Rebecca arrived, she found the door open and the sound of hammering coming from the back of the house. Jeffrey had already started picking up the shards. "You don't have to do this now," she said, stopping in the doorway. "I do," he replied, without stopping his movement. "This house won't heal on its own." Rebecca entered cautiously, observing the damage with experienced eyes. The destruction was worse than she imagined, but what struck her most was the way Jeffrey, in silence, was already restoring it. "We'll take this to court. He'll answer for everything," she said. "I know," he replied, "but now, this here is my responsibility." "You don't feel angry?" "No, just sadness, and the desire to return to this house what it gave me." Without asking for help, Jeffrey cleaned each room. He swept, sanded, repaired. He rebuilt the facade with his own hands. It took him weeks to fix the damage. He never complained. And when the court finally confirmed Charlotte's will as legitimate, he didn't celebrate. He simply thanked in silence and went back to work. It was Jessica who heard it first. "He said he's going to turn the house into a shelter," she said, surprised, "in the market." "A shelter? What do you mean?" asked a neighbor. "A shelter for homeless people. He's calling it Charlotte's House." The news spread quickly. Some doubted, others were moved, but Jeffrey didn't care about others' reactions. He followed his plan calmly. There will be beds, there will be hot food, And there will be someone to listen, he told a friend while painting the gate. You're doing this for her, right? She taught me that a warm meal and a safe roof are worth more than any bank account. I haven't forgotten. The shelter started small, 3 beds in the back room, then 5. Later, a second room was adapted. Volunteers began appearing slowly. People from the street, people who remembered Charlotte, people who believed in new beginnings. Rebecca, now retired, visited frequently. You've turned this house into a home for many, she said, sitting in the room where Charlotte's portrait had returned to its place on the wall. I just did what she would have done, Jeffrey replied. No one expected this from you. Not even me. The name Charlotte's House was soon said with respect. Little by little, it became a reference in the town. There were no flashy signs, no sponsorships, no interviews. Jeffrey refused any exposure. I don't want fame. I just want no one to sleep fearing the street, he would repeat. Meanwhile, Frank was going through a slow and painful downfall. After being legally held accountable for the damages, he was fined, publicly reprimanded, and abandoned by his colleagues. His wife asked for a divorce months later, without much explanation. You were always absent, but now it's something else, she said, packing her things. Won't you even try to understand my side? He asked. I've tried for years. I just don't want to live in a place where even silence weighs. Frank moved to a small rented apartment on the outskirts. He started working autonomously as an accountant, serving a few clients. The nights grew long. He suffered from insomnia. He spent hours in front of the turned-off television, his head spinning with thoughts that never organized. Sometimes he went out for aimless walks. On these walks, by instinct or guilt, he would end up passing by the street where the old house was. He stopped on the opposite sidewalk. He looked at the painted gate, the light on the porch, and listened from a distance to voices, laughter, and footsteps from inside. He never had the courage to enter. To others, he was just another man walking alone. But inside, every visit was a wound. His ex-wife restarted her life in another city. She was calmly reorganizing her days, keeping in touch only with distant relatives. She no longer spoke of Frank. When someone asked, she would simply say, he got stuck in what he couldn't see. Rebecca continued to be present at Charlotte's house. She brought cakes, helped with documents, or simply sat down to talk. She was always received with warmth. You know this only exists because you trusted her decision, Jeffrey said one afternoon. She made me promise I would protect you until the end. Not that you needed it, of course, Rebecca replied, smiling. Jeffrey still lived in the room where Charlotte used to sew. He kept everything as she had left it. He tended the garden with dedication. He talked to the plants, to the newcomers, to those who left after finding some direction. The chair in the living room stayed in the same place. Charlotte's portrait on the wall, clean, firm. He never took it down. He would always say, the memory of kindness needs space to blossom. The house that was once silence now breathed. Voices, footsteps, life. People who had lost everything found a point of support there. It wasn't charity, but respect. The recognition that no one deserves to disappear. And so, the silent gesture of an old woman changed destinies. It faced prejudices. It broke ideas of right by blood. Charlotte didn't need a stage nor speeches. She died in silence, but lives in every wall she left standing, and in the man who knew how to honor her day after day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.